My name is Eleanor Vance, and for 35 years, my greatest joy, my defining purpose, was my son, Leo. I nurtured his scraped knees, celebrated his small victories, and believed his heart was a direct reflection of my own. I never imagined the love I gave so freely would be turned against me like a weapon, its soft edges sharpened to a killing point. The war for my life began not with a bang or a shout or a moment of shattering glass. It began with a party I wasn't invited to, a celebration of a life I thought was intrinsically part of mine. It began the day I finally asked about the wedding, and my daughter-in-law, a woman I had welcomed into my home, sneered and said, "We just got married today, Eleanor. We only invited special people." Before the silence, there was peace. Our life, Arthur's and mine, was a well-tended garden, predictable in its seasons and beautiful in its familiarity. Our home, a 2-story colonial nestled in a quiet suburb of Philadelphia, was the brick-and-mortar heart of that life. 40 years of memories were soaked into its plaster walls, from Leo's first steps on the worn oak floors to the faint pencil marks on a doorframe tracking his height. My days followed a gentle rhythm. I'd wake with the morning light, tend to my roses, my one small vanity, and then Arthur and I would share the newspaper over coffee, our comfortable silence a language of its own. He was the sturdy, pragmatic engineer, I the literature teacher who saw metaphors in everything. He was the roots, I was the leaves. Together, we had built a good, solid tree. Leo, our only branch, was 35 and still searching for his place in the sun. He had his father's height, but my softer features, and a dreamer's disposition that had led him through a series of ambitious but ultimately failed tech startups. Each failure had chipped away at his confidence, but never at our love for him. "He just needs the right break," I would tell Arthur, who would grunt in a way that meant he agreed, but worried. Then came Chloe. She arrived in Leo's life like a sudden, dazzling sun shower. She was a financial advisor, she said. Sharp and polished, with a smile that seemed to light up a room and an ambition that burned just behind her eyes. She adored Leo, or so it seemed. She praised his vision, smoothed his anxieties, and dressed him in clothes that made him look more successful than he was. I was charmed and relieved. Here was a woman who saw the potential in my son that I had always had. I willingly overlooked the small things. The way her eyes would catalog the antiques in our living room, a flicker of appraisal in their depths. The casual way she'd ask about the neighborhood's property values. The time she picked up a small silver box on the mantelpiece and said, "This must be worth a fortune," her tone less admiring than calculating.
"She's just a modern woman, Eleanor," I told myself, pruning a wilting rose in the garden. "She's direct. It's a different generation." Arthur was less convinced. "There's something brittle about her," he'd said once after they'd left from Sunday dinner, "like glass." But he saw how happy Leo seemed, how his shoulders were a little less slumped, and so he too kept his reservations to himself. We wanted our son's happiness more than we wanted to be right. That was our first and most critical mistake. Their engagement was announced 6 months later over dinner at our house. Chloe produced a flawless diamond that glittered under the dining room chandelier, and Leo beamed, looking more proud than I had seen him in years. We celebrated, of course, uncorking a bottle of champagne we'd been saving. In that bubbly, golden moment, any doubts I harbored were washed away by the sheer force of my son's joy. It was a week later that Chloe initiated what she called the talk. "Eleanor, Arthur," she began, her tone a perfect blend of professional competence and familial concern. She had spread some papers out on our coffee table. Now that Leo and I are starting our lives together, I want to make sure you two are absolutely secure. We need to talk about estate planning." I bristled slightly. It felt so transactional. But Chloe's delivery was flawless. She spoke of market volatility, of protecting our assets from unforeseen medical costs, of making things seamless and easy for Leo down the line. She used terms like revocable trusts and asset management, making it all sound like a complex but necessary procedure, like vital surgery for our finances. "The best thing to do," she concluded, tapping a perfectly manicured nail on a thick document, "is to grant me power of attorney. It's just a formality, really. It allows me to manage your accounts, pay bills from your pension, and shield your main asset, this house, from being tied up in probate. It simplifies everything." "I think we're managing just fine, Chloe," Arthur said, his voice flat. Chloe's smile didn't falter. She turned her full attention to him, her expression softening. "Of course you are, Arthur. You've done an amazing job. Think of this as an insurance policy. With your heart condition, what if something happens and Eleanor is too overwhelmed to deal with the banks? This is about protecting her, about protecting everything you've both worked so hard for." She then looked at Leo, who nodded earnestly. "Mom, Dad, she's a professional. She knows this stuff. It's for the best," he urged, his voice filled with a sincerity I knew he believed. He trusted her completely, and I trusted him. And so we signed. We sat at the heavy oak desk in Arthur's study, the one he'd used to design bridges, and with a few strokes of a pen, we handed over the keys to our kingdom. I remember the weight of the pen in my hand, the crisp smell of the paper. I remember Chloe's reassuring smile as she stacked the documents neatly, one of which was the quitclaim deed I would only learn about much later. At the time, all I felt was a sense of relief, the feeling that I had done a responsible, motherly thing. I had secured my son's future.
The distance grew subtly at first. Phone calls were shorter. Sunday dinners became less frequent, canceled at the last minute with vague excuses. Chloe's networking, Leo would say, a client event. I felt a growing sense of unease, a quiet hum of anxiety beneath the surface of my days. The wedding planning was a closed door. When I asked about dates or venues, Chloe would give me an airy, dismissive wave. "Oh, we're keeping it very small, Eleanor. Super low-key. We don't want a big fuss." Then, on a bright Saturday afternoon in October, the hum of anxiety became a screaming siren. Our neighbor, Carol, leaned over the fence while I was weeding the petunias. "Eleanor, I saw the pictures on Facebook. Just gorgeous," she gushed. "The venue was stunning. You must be so proud." I stared at her, my gardening trowel frozen in my hand. "I'm sorry, Carol. What pictures?" Her face fell, a mask of confusion and embarrassment. "Oh, the wedding. Leo and Chloe's wedding. It was today, wasn't it?" My blood ran cold. I mumbled an excuse and hurried inside, my hands shaking as I opened my laptop. It took me less than a minute to find them. A public album posted by one of Chloe's friends. There they were. Chloe in a magnificent lace gown, Leo in a sharp tuxedo, standing under an arch of white roses at a lavish countryside estate. There were dozens of smiling guests, friends, distant cousins, Chloe's parents, but not us, his own mother and father. We were not there. Each photograph was a separate twisting knife. They came home late that evening, flushed with champagne and celebration. They walked in, expecting, I suppose, for the house to be dark and quiet. But I was waiting for them in the living room, with Arthur silent and grim-faced beside me. Leo's smile vanished the moment he saw our faces. Mom, Dad, what's wrong? I couldn't bring myself to look at him. My gaze was fixed on Chloe, who stood there, her expression hardening from surprise to defiance. My voice was quiet, dangerously calm. We saw the pictures, Chloe. It looked like a beautiful wedding. Leo flinched, finally understanding. Mom, I was going to tell you. It all just happened so fast. Don't. I cut him off. Then I asked the question, the one that had been echoing in the hollow space in my chest for hours. Why? Why wouldn't you invite us to your wedding?
Chloe stepped forward, her expensive perfume filling the space between us. She looked me up and down, a flicker of something triumphant and cruel in her eyes. The mask was gone. The performance was over. We just got married today, Eleanor, she sneered, the name a deliberate, casual insult. We only invited special people. Chloe's words hung in the air, glittering and venomous. The silence that followed was a living thing, thick and suffocating. I saw Leo flinch, a flicker of shame crossing his face before it was replaced by a stubborn defensive pout. He looked from my face to Arthur's, then back to his wife, and in that moment he made his choice. He said nothing. He simply stood beside her, a silent accomplice. That night, the house I had lived in for 40 years became a foreign country. The war was not declared with shouts, but with the drawing of invisible lines. Chloe and Leo moved through the rooms with an air of ownership, their conversations stopping abruptly when Arthur or I entered. Meals became tense, silent affairs. The easy warmth that had once filled our home was leached away, replaced by a cold, cloying politeness that was worse than any argument. Chloe took over the running of the house with a terrifying efficiency. She hired a cleaning service that scrubbed away the familiar scent of lemon wax and old books, leaving behind a sterile chemical smell. She reorganized the kitchen, placing my favorite mug on a shelf I couldn't reach. Each change was small, a tiny pinprick, but together they were a systematic erasure of my presence, of my life. I tried to talk to Leo once, cornering him in the hallway as he headed for the door. Leo, please, I whispered, my voice tight with unshed tears. We need to talk about this, about what she said. He wouldn't meet my eyes. He just shook his head, pulling his arm from my grasp. Mom, you're overreacting. Chloe was stressed. You just need to give her some space. He walked out, leaving me alone in the hallway, the silence of the house pressing in on me. He wasn't just defending her. He was invalidating me. He was telling me that my pain was an overreaction, an invention. It was the first turn of the screw. The gaslighting began in earnest. It was a campaign of 1,000 tiny cuts, each one designed to make me doubt my own mind. One afternoon, I came downstairs to find my grandmother's antique tea set, which had always sat on the sideboard, was gone. Chloe, have you seen my grandmother's china? I asked, trying to keep my voice even. She looked up from her laptop with an expression of mild surprise. Oh, Eleanor, don't you remember? You told me you wanted Carol from next door to have it. I dropped it off this morning. She was thrilled. I would never do that, I stammered, my heart pounding. That was my grandmother's. Chloe's face softened into a mask of pity. She walked over and placed a cool hand on my arm. Honey, you were so insistent yesterday. You said it was just collecting dust and you wanted someone to enjoy it. She turned to Leo, who had just walked in. Leo, you were here. You heard her. Leo looked from me to her and nodded slowly. Yeah, Mom, I remember. You were talking about wanting to declutter. I stared at them, at their two united faces, one full of false concern and the other clouded with a weak, confused conviction. Did I say that? My mind felt like a fog. The memory was a blank space. For a terrifying second, I believed them. Maybe I was forgetting things. The narrative took root. I would hear Chloe on the phone with relatives, her voice a low, sympathetic murmur. She's just not herself lately. Gets so confused. Arthur and I are doing our best, but it's difficult. She used my love as her weapon. When I would object to a decision she'd made, she would frame it as a sign of my instability. "We're only doing this because we love you," she'd say, her words a sweet poison. She isolated me, brick by brick, until I began to feel like a ghost in my own life, my own home, my own mind. The financial strangulation was more direct. It started with my debit card being declined at the grocery store. Humiliated, I came home to find Chloe at the kitchen table, our bank statements spread before her. "Ah, Eleanor, good," she said, as if I hadn't just walked in, my face flushed with shame. "I've been restructuring your portfolios. We had to move some assets around to cover an unforeseen tax liability. The accounts are a little thin right now, but it's for the best in the long run." Her explanations were a whirlwind of jargon I couldn't follow. When Arthur tried to question her, she would produce complex charts and graphs, overwhelming him with data until he fell silent, exhausted and confused. Our retirement savings, our life's work, became a foreign language, and she was the sole interpreter. The final violation came a month later. I went to the small jewelry box where I had kept the few good pieces my mother had left me, a string of pearls, a sapphire ring, and a delicate gold locket. It was empty. This time, I didn't hesitate. I marched downstairs and confronted Chloe. "Where is my mother's jewelry?" She didn't feign surprise. She simply sighed, a theatrical display of exasperation. "Eleanor, we talked about this. We had to have them appraised for the insurance writer on the estate. They're in a secure bank vault." "I want them back," I said, my voice shaking with rage. "The bank is closed, and honestly, it's better this way. With your forgetfulness, we can't risk you misplacing them, can we?" That night, I wept. I locked myself in the bathroom and cried until my throat was raw. I cried not for the jewelry, but for the son who sat in the next room and did nothing while his wife dismantled my life piece by piece. I cried for the woman I used to be, the confident, capable mother and teacher who was being systematically replaced by a frail, confused, and powerless old woman. I felt a grief so profound it was a physical weight crushing the air from my lungs. I was drowning, and the hands pushing me under were the hands of my own child. The turning point came on a cold, rain-lashed night in November. Arthur's heart had been acting up, the stress of our new life manifesting in a persistent rattling cough that kept us both awake. Around 2 a.m., I went downstairs to get him a glass of water. The house was dark and silent, except for the drumming of the rain against the windows. As I reached the bottom of the stairs, I saw a sliver of light from under the kitchen door and heard the low murmur of voices. I froze, my hand on the banister. It was Leo and Chloe. I crept closer, my bare feet silent on the cold floorboards. Her voice was a low, vicious hiss, sharp with anger. "Another call from the creditor, Leo. They're threatening to sue. All your vision has bought us as a mountain of debt." I know. His voice was a miserable whisper. "I thought the last withdrawal would hold them off." "It's a drop in the ocean," she snapped. "But it's fine. It's all taken care of. Stop being so weak." There was a pause, and then she spoke again, her voice dropping even lower, becoming conspiratorial and chillingly calm. "The life insurance policies are active. Once we're on that Alaskan cruise, all it takes is one dark, icy night and a tragic slip over the railing. Everyone will feel so sorry for us. Grieving son, devoted daughter-in-law, left to manage the estate. They're old, Leo. It happens. The glass I was holding slipped from my numb fingers and shattered on the floor, but they didn't hear it over the sound of the rain. I stood there in the darkness, the shards of glass at my feet, and I felt something inside me break and then reform. It was as if I had been underwater for months and had suddenly, violently broken the surface. The fog of confusion, the suffocating grief, the crushing self-doubt, it all evaporated in an instant, burned away by the cold, white-hot fire of her words. My tears stopped. My body stopped shaking. The pain in my chest did not disappear, but it crystallized, transforming from a heavy, sorrowful weight into a shard of ice. The woman who had cried herself to sleep was gone. The mother who grieved for her lost son was gone. In her place stood someone else, someone cold and clear and absolutely terrifyingly resolute. I backed away from the door, silent as a shadow, and went back upstairs. The war was no longer about my feelings. It was about my life, and I was going to fight.
I walked back up the stairs, each step deliberate and soundless. The woman who had crept down them 15 minutes earlier, a vessel of grief and confusion, did not return. A stranger came back in her place, someone I was only just beginning to know. She was cold and clear-eyed, and she was not afraid. Arthur was awake when I entered our bedroom, his face etched with worry in the dim light from the hallway. "Eleanor, is everything all right?" he whispered, his voice raspy from his cough. I closed the door, the soft click of the latch sounding like a chamber being sealed. I sat on the edge of our bed, the bed we had shared for 41 years, and I took his hand. It felt warm and familiar in my own, which was as cold as ice. "Arthur," I said, my voice devoid of any tremor, "they are going to try to kill us." I told him everything. I recounted the conversation I'd overheard with the dispassionate clarity of a court reporter. The debts, the life insurance policies, the Alaskan cruise, the accidental slip over the railing. I watched his face cycle through the emotions I no longer felt. Disbelief giving way to a sickening comprehension, which then curdled into a deep, primal rage. His knuckles were white where he gripped my hand. For a moment, he looked like he might leap out of bed and storm downstairs, a foolish, fatal act of fury. But then, he looked into my eyes. I don't know what he saw there. Not fear, not sorrow, but a hard, polished resolve. He saw the stranger I had become, and his expression shifted, the hot rage cooling into something harder and more useful. He squeezed my hand, a silent message passing between us. He understood. This was not a problem to be solved with shouting. This was a war to be won with strategy. "All right," he said, his voice a low growl. "All right, Eleanor. What do we do?" In the darkness of our bedroom, surrounded by the ghosts of a life they were trying to steal, we made a silent pact. We would not run. We would not confront them. We would play the parts they had assigned us. We would be the frail, forgetful old parents. We would be the perfect, unsuspecting victims, right up until the moment we sprang the trap. The next morning, I began my performance. When Chloe came into the kitchen, I gave her a weak, watery smile as though I'd been crying all night. "Good morning, dear," I said, my voice trembling slightly. "You're up early," she said, her eyes scanning me for any sign of suspicion. She saw none. "Arthur had a bad night," I lied. I was worried. Later that morning, as I was carrying a small stack of plates to the cupboard, I let one slip from my grasp. It shattered on the tile floor. I cried out, a theatrical gasp of fright, and pressed a hand to my chest. "Oh my goodness, how clumsy of me! My hands are just so shaky today." Chloe rushed in, her face a perfect mask of annoyance barely concealed by concern. "Eleanor, honestly, just leave it. I'll get it. You should go sit down."
It was perfect. Every stumble, every forgotten word, every moment of feigned weakness cemented their narrative. They saw what they wanted to see, a woman deteriorating, becoming a liability. They had no idea I was watching their every move, cataloging their condescending smiles and their whispered conversations, my mind as sharp and clear as the shards of glass on the floor. That afternoon, I told them I had a follow-up appointment with my doctor. Just a checkup, I said airily. Dr. Miller is worried about my blood pressure. It was an easy lie, and it got me out of the house, alone, for 2 precious hours. I didn't go to the doctor's office. I drove to a park on the other side of town, my hands steady on the wheel. I sat on a cold park bench, the autumn leaves skittering around my feet, and I made the most important call of my life. She picked up on the second ring. "B, it's Eleanor." "Al, how are you? I was just thinking about you." Her voice was warm and familiar, a sound from the world before. "I need your help," I said, and the dam of my composure finally broke, not with tears, but with the cold, hard facts. I need a lawyer. We met in the hushed, dusty biography section of the city's main library, a place of comforting anonymity. Bia's face, usually so quick to smile, was a thundercloud of loyal fury as I laid out the story. She listened without interruption, her sharp legal mind processing every detail, from the forged deed to the whispered murder plot. When I finished, she didn't offer condolences, she offered a strategy. "Okay," she said, her voice a low, controlled whisper. "Grief comes later, Eleanor. Right now, we act. Your word against theirs is a tragedy. Your word with irrefutable proof is a conviction." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "From this moment on, you are building a legal case. First, we need undeniable evidence of their intent, audio, video if possible. We need to record them discussing the plan, the insurance, the cruise. Second, I'm hiring a private investigator, my treat, a man I've used before. He's a ghost. He'll dig into their finances, find the insurance policies, and get us copies of every document Chloe had you sign." She reached across the table and gripped my hand. "And third, and this is the hardest part, you and Arthur cannot break character, not for a second. You have to be the victims they believe you are." "What about the police?" Arthur had asked me this, and I asked it of Bia. "Not yet," she said firmly. "We go to them when the case is ironclad, when we can hand them the culprits, the motive, the means, and the confession all tied up in a nice little bow. We give them no wiggle room, no chance for Chloe to charm her way out of it." I left the library with a clear, cold sense of purpose. I was no longer just a mother fighting for her life. I was a client, building a case. Arthur ordered the devices that night. 2 miniature audio recorders and 3 tiny cameras disguised as USB chargers. They arrived 2 days later. While Chloe and Leo were out, we moved with the swift, silent precision of a special operations team. We placed 1 camera in the living room, aimed at the sofa where they always sat, another one into the study. We hid the audio recorders in strategic locations. The house was no longer our home. It was our surveillance hub. 2 days after the devices were installed, I initiated the next phase of the plan.
We met in the hushed,
Walking through the
dusty
living room with a
biography
basket of
section of the
laundry,
city's main
I
library,
tripped
a
on the
place
edge
of
of the
comforting
rug,
anonymity.
pitching forward in a dramatic,
face,
sprawling
usually
fall.
so
I let
quick
out
to
a
smile,
cry of
was
pain,
a
clutching my
thundercloud
hip.
of
Loyal fury as I laid out the story. She listened without interruption, her sharp legal mind processing every detail, from the forged deed to the whispered murder plot. When I finished, she didn't offer condolences, she offered a strategy. "Okay," she said, her voice a low, controlled whisper. "Grief comes later, Eleanor. Right now, we act. Your word against theirs is a tragedy. Your word with irrefutable proof is a conviction." She leaned forward, her eyes blazing. "From this moment on, you are building a legal case. First, we need undeniable evidence of their intent, audio, video if possible. We need to record them discussing the plan, the insurance, the cruise. Second, I'm hiring a private investigator, my treat, a man I've used before. He's a ghost. He'll dig into their finances, find the insurance policies, and get us copies of every document Chloe had you sign. She reached across the table and gripped my hand. And third, and this is the hardest part, you and Arthur cannot break character, not for a second. You have to be the victims they believe you are. What about the police? Arthur had asked me this, and I asked it of Bia. Not yet, she said firmly. We go to them when the case is ironclad, when we can hand them the culprits, the motive, the means, and the confession all tied up in a nice little bow. We give them no wiggle room, no chance for Chloe to charm her way out of it. I left the library with a clear, cold sense of purpose. I was no longer just a mother fighting for her life. I was a client, building a case. Arthur ordered the devices that night. 2 miniature audio recorders and 3 tiny cameras disguised as USB chargers. They arrived 2 days later. While Chloe and Leo were out, we moved with the swift, silent precision of a special operations team. We placed one camera in the living room, aimed at the sofa where they always sat, another one into the study. We hid the audio recorders in strategic locations. The house was no longer our home. It was our surveillance hub. 2 days after the devices were installed, I initiated the next phase of the plan. Walking through the living room with a basket of laundry, I tripped on the edge of the rug, pitching forward in a dramatic, sprawling fall. I let out a cry of pain, clutching my hip. They came running. The fall was entirely fake, but the terror in Leo's eyes was real. Chloe, however, knelt beside me, her touch professional and cold, her eyes already calculating the new advantage this gave them. "We need to get you to a doctor," Leo exclaimed. No, I moaned. "I think it's just a bad sprain. I need to rest in bed for a few days." It worked perfectly. My feigned injury gave me the excuse to remain in our bedroom, seemingly bedridden, where I could monitor the audio feeds through a small receiver. Arthur, playing the part of the doting, worried husband, brought me my meals. It was on the second day of my recovery that we caught our first piece of solid gold. Through the receiver, I heard Chloe's voice from the living room, clear as a bell. It's almost a blessing in disguise. She's so frail now. After a fall like that, on a slippery cruise ship deck, no one will ever question it. It will look like a tragic but predictable accident. I pressed the button to save the recording, a grim smile touching my lips for the first time in months. A week later, Bia called with the PI's report. The news was even worse, and therefore better than we'd imagined. Leo was in debt to the tune of nearly $500,000 from his failed ventures and from financing Chloe's extravagant lifestyle. And the PI had found them. 2 life insurance policies taken out 3 months prior, one on me, one on Arthur. The beneficiary for both was a trust managed by a single trustee, Chloe. The payout for each was $2 million. "We have them, Eleanor," Bia said, her voice tight with triumph. That very evening, Chloe and Leo came into our bedroom, their faces arranged in expressions of loving concern. "Mom, Dad," Leo began, "we've been thinking, with everything that's happened, with the fall, we all need a break, a real chance to heal and reconnect as a family." Chloe stepped forward, placing a brochure on my bedside table. The cover showed a majestic cruise ship sailing past towering blue-white glaciers. "We booked it," she said, her voice like honey. "A family trip to Alaska, just the 4 of us. A chance to put all this difficulty behind us."
I looked at the brochure, at the picture of the ship that was meant to be my tomb. I looked up at my son's hopeful face and my daughter-in-law's predatory smile. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan ice. Arthur took my hand. "That sounds wonderful," I said, arranging my face into a mask of tearful gratitude. Doesn't it, Arthur? A new beginning. Wonderful, he echoed, his voice thick with an emotion they mistook for relief. They saw our acceptance as their final victory. We saw it as our consent to enter the battlefield. The trap was set. Now all we had to do was walk into it. The cruise ship was a floating city of light and forced merriment, a glittering behemoth gliding through the icy dark waters of the Alaskan coast. By day, we stood on the deck, wrapped in heavy coats, and watched mountains of ancient ice calve into the sea. The sound, a thunderous crack and roar, felt like a fitting soundtrack for the fracturing of our family. The glaciers themselves, serene and beautiful on the surface, but full of deadly, hidden crevasses, were a perfect metaphor for the woman we were traveling with. Chloe was radiant. She moved through the ship's opulent lounges with the easy confidence of a conquering queen, Leo trailing in her wake like a nervous page boy. To any observer, we were a picture of a happy, multi-generational family on a luxury vacation. They wouldn't see the way Arthur and I never let Chloe walk behind us. They wouldn't notice that we never accepted a drink she poured. They wouldn't see the way my eyes would briefly meet those of a quiet, middle-aged man with a camera, a tourist who just so happened to be at every scenic overlook we were. Bia's private investigator, our silent guardian angel. The tension was a constant, humming wire. We were living on a stage, playing our parts with exhausting precision. I was the frail matriarch, prone to dizziness. Arthur was the doting husband, his hand always ready to steady my arm. We were two
The
old
third night
mice,
was the captain's
knowingly
gala,
walking
the ship's
deeper
formal
into
affair.
a trap, all
Chloe
while
descended
watching the
the grand
cat with a
staircase in a
vigilance she
backless
could not
emerald green
comprehend.
dress, a slash of color against the ship's gold and crystal decor. She looked like a beautiful, venomous snake. "Eleanor, you look lovely," she said, her smile not reaching her cold eyes. "But you look a little flushed. Maybe you need some fresh air after dinner." The invitation was offered. Later, as the ship's orchestra played a syrupy waltz, Chloe leaned in. "They say the northern lights might be visible from the forward observation deck tonight. It's very private up there. Why don't we go? Just you and me. A little mother-daughter time." Leo, standing beside her, visibly paled. "Chloe, maybe that's not a good idea. It's cold." "Nonsense," she said, her voice sharp. She turned her dazzling smile at me. "Eleanor isn't afraid of a little cold, are you?" "No, dear, I'm not afraid at all." Arthur caught my eye from across the room and gave a nearly imperceptible nod. He had his hand resting on his chest, ready. The performance was about to reach its climax. Chapter 15. The forward observation deck was deserted, just as she'd known it would be. The wind was a knife, cutting through my coat. Far below, the black water churned, flecked with ice. The ship's lights cast long, distorted shadows, and the orchestra was a faint, ghostly echo. "See? Isn't it breathtaking?" Chloe said. Her arm linked through mine, her grip surprisingly strong. She began to steer me toward the railing, to a section of the deck that was darker than the rest. My feet felt heavy, my body braced for the inevitable. The PI, I knew, was tucked away in a recessed doorway 100 feet behind us, his long-lens camera ready. "You know, Eleanor, I'm so glad we took this trip. It's good to clear the air, to let go of old things." She was propelling me forward, step by step, closer to the edge. The railing was just a few feet away now. It looked terrifyingly low. This was it. "Sometimes," she whispered, her breath a cloud in the frigid air, "you just have to let go." Her hand tightened on my arm, ready to push. And then, from the main ballroom doors behind us,
came a strangled cry. "Arthur!" We both spun around. Arthur was slumped against the doorframe, his face a mask of pain, his hand clutching his heart. Passengers began to rush toward him. In an instant, the deserted deck was flooded with light and people and noise. 2 crew members were at Arthur's side, calling for the ship's doctor. I looked at Chloe. Her face, in the sudden glare of the lights, was a portrait of pure, thwarted rage. Her perfect plan had been ruined by an old man's failing heart. The irony was exquisite. Back in our adjoining suites, the charade was over. Arthur, who had made a miraculous recovery the moment the ship's doctor was out of sight, sat in an armchair, his face grim. I stood by the window, watching the dark sea. Leo and Chloe came in from their side. Leo was wringing his hands, his face a mess of fear and relief. Chloe's composure was back in place, but it was brittle, fragile. "Thank God you're all right, Arthur. We were so worried." "Stop it, Chloe," I said, turning from the window. My voice was quiet, but it cut through the room like a shard of ice. "Just stop. The performance is over." I walked to the small table between the sofas and placed a small digital audio recorder on it. I pressed play. Her own voice filled the room, cold and clear. "It's almost a blessing in disguise. She's so frail now. After a fall like that, on a slippery cruise ship deck, no one will ever question it." I pressed stop. The silence that followed was absolute. Leo broke it. A sob tore from his throat, a raw, animal sound of despair. He collapsed onto the sofa, his head in his hands. "I'm sorry," he wept. "Mom, Dad, I'm so sorry. I didn't."
Chloe, however, stood ramrod straight. Her face was pale, but her eyes were defiant. She laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Oh, for God's sake, you're pathetic, Leo. And you," she pointed a shaking finger at me, "you're a delusional old woman. That proves nothing. You probably doctored it." "Do you think so?" Arthur asked, his voice a low rumble. "We have so many other recordings, and photos, and financial statements. Our friend Bia has been very, very busy." Chloe stared at him, her mind racing, looking for an exit, a lie, a way to spin this. She still believed she could talk her way out. She underestimated us one last time. "This is ridiculous," she sneered. "A fantasy concocted by a senile old woman." Arthur leaned forward, his expression unreadable. "Let's not talk about fantasies, Chloe. Let's talk about reality. Let's talk about a man named Howard Sterling." The name hit her like a physical blow. For the first time, a flicker of genuine panic appeared in her eyes. Howard Sterling was her first boss, the owner of a small investment firm. "I don't know who that is," she said, but her voice was a fraction too high. "I think you do," Arthur continued, calmly, as if discussing the weather. "He was your employer about 10 years ago. A very trusting man, I'm told. So trusting he didn't notice his sharp new assistant was systematically embezzling from his clients. But he did, eventually. He confronted you on a Thursday afternoon." Leo looked up, his face streaked with tears, a dawning horror in his eyes. "That very night," Arthur said, his voice dropping, "there was a fire at the office. An electrical fault, the report said. Mr. Sterling, who had been working late, died of smoke inhalation. All his financial records were destroyed, and you, his devoted assistant, were the sole beneficiary of his will, which he had so conveniently changed just a month prior. You told the police he thought of you as a daughter." I watched Chloe's face. The mask didn't just crack, it disintegrated.
The sophisticated, charming woman was gone, replaced by something hard, feral, and stripped of all pretense. The secret she had buried for a decade, the foundation upon which she had built her new life, had just been excavated in a cruise ship cabin in the middle of the ocean. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at us, her chest rising and falling rapidly. And in her eyes, I finally saw the truth. I was looking at a killer. She knew in that moment that she was utterly and completely trapped. A dead, ringing silence filled the suite. Chloe stood frozen, her face a marble mask of hate. Leo was still sobbing, his broken apologies muffled by his hands. In that moment, the power in the room had shifted entirely. We were no longer their victims. They were our prisoners, held captive by a truth they could not escape. Then came a sharp, authoritative knock on the suite's connecting door. Leo flinched as if he'd been shot. Chloe's head snapped toward the sound, her eyes wide with a final, desperate flicker of hope that it was room service, a steward, anyone but who she knew it must be. Arthur rose slowly and opened the door. Bea Hayes stepped inside, her expression calm and professional. She was not alone. Behind her stood the ship's captain in his formal uniform and two uniformed officers of the Juneau Port Authority. The trap, so carefully set, had finally been sprung. "Chloe Vance, Leo Vance," Bea said, her voice carrying the full weight of the law. "It's over." I stepped forward and handed a small gray USB drive to the lead officer. "Here," I said, my voice steady. "You'll find audio recordings, financial statements, copies of 2 fraudulent life insurance policies, and a full report from a private investigator, including photographic evidence from this evening." Reality crashed down upon them. Leo simply sagged, offering no resistance as an officer gently but firmly pulled him to his feet. But Chloe's defiance ignited one last time. "This is insane!" she shrieked, her voice cracking. "It was him! This was all his idea! He was dead, he was desperate, he manipulated me!" Leo looked up, his face a mess of tears and betrayal. "Her? No, it was her! She told me what to do, she planned everything. I just wanted—" His voice trailed off into a pathetic whimper. Watching them tear at each other, 2 drowning people pulling each other under, I felt nothing but a vast, empty pity. Their wicked alliance, so strong when they were united against us, had dissolved into dust at the first touch of consequence. The officers cuffed them. As they led Chloe past me, her eyes met mine. They were not the eyes of a schemer or a charmer. They were the flat, dead eyes of a shark. "You will regret this, Eleanor," she hissed. "No, my dear," I replied, the words falling from my lips with a strange and final peace. "The regretting is all yours now." Our return to Pennsylvania was a blur. The story became a local media sensation, the stuff of lurid television specials, the cruise ship plot, betrayal at sea. We were hounded by reporters, but Bea shielded us from the worst of it. We stayed with her for the first few weeks, unable to bear the thought of returning to our house, which now felt less like a home and more like a crime scene. The trial was 6 months later. I had to testify. Sitting in the witness box, looking out at my son and the woman who had been his wife, I felt a strange detachment. They looked small and diminished in their prison jumpsuits, stripped of their power and their fine clothes.
The evidence was overwhelming. The recordings I had made were played in the silent courtroom, Chloe's cold, clear voice planning my death for everyone to hear. The PI's financial reports laid out the motive in stark, undeniable numbers. The past case of Mr. Sterling's death was reopened, and with a new aggressive investigation, the old witness was found and a new case was built. The verdict was never in doubt. Chloe was found guilty on all counts: fraud, conspiracy to commit murder, and first-degree murder for the death of Howard Sterling. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She didn't flinch when the sentence was read. For his part, Leo was convicted of conspiracy and fraud. His public breakdown and his lawyer's argument that he was a weak man manipulated by a master criminal earned him a measure of leniency. He was sentenced to 20 years in a federal prison. All the contracts he and Chloe had coerced us into signing were declared null and void. The house, our money, our lives, they were legally ours again. But you can never truly go back. A year has passed. The brisk, chilly air of Pennsylvania is a distant memory. We live by the sea now, in a small, quiet town in North Carolina. Our home is a modest condo with a wide balcony that looks out over the Atlantic. The roar of the ocean is a constant, soothing presence, washing away the silence that had taken root in our old house. We sold the house in Philadelphia. We sold the antiques, the furniture, every last physical piece of that life. We needed to. You cannot heal in a place that holds the ghosts of such a profound betrayal. Here, we are simply Eleanor and Arthur, a retired couple who enjoy long walks on the beach and quiet evenings reading. We are healing. Once a month, we drive 2 hours inland to a medium security prison. The visits are quiet, heavy with all the things that can never be unsaid or undone. Leo is thinner, his face etched with a permanent sorrow. He is remorseful. I believe he is. He apologizes every time we see him. The words taste like ash in the stale, recycled air of the visiting room. I don't know if I have forgiven him. Forgiveness feels too simple a word for the tangled knot of emotions I feel. I look at him and I see the little boy who loved baseball and the troubled man who was willing to sacrifice his parents for a lifestyle he hadn't earned. The love I have for him is real, but it is an altered thing, a love that lives in the ruins. It is the sorrowful, complicated love for what was and for what can never be again. Last night, I sat on our balcony, watching the moon lay a silver path across the dark water. I thought about everything we had lost and everything we had managed to save. I opened the new journal I have started, and I wrote. For years, I believed a mother's love must be an endless, forgiving sea. But I was wrong. Love cannot exist without respect. It cannot survive betrayal. True love is a harbor, not an open ocean to be plundered. It must have shores, and I have finally learned to defend mine.